Nah, this will get us. Welcome once again to the Radical Imagination, which is aired every Sunday evening on MNN at 8 p.m. and is repeated on MNN4 Thursday evening also at 8. I'm Jim Vrettos, a sociologist at John Jay College in New York City, and I'm your host for a show not only for the progressive left, but for all people who are open to the possibility of imagining and bringing about a fair, more just, and humane world. Our vision and approach does have its foundation in the left tradition, but it also realizes that we don't want to be stuck in a prison of narrow labels and an ossified view of reality. And speaking of narrow, dysfunctional labels, our show tonight will be about a criminal justice system and policing structure that does seem to be severely broken and in need of enlightened imagination and radical transformation. One doesn't have to be a committed Marxist or left ideologue to simply look around at who the criminal justice system seeks to punish and control, and who the police are basically expected to police. But keep in mind, the criminal justice system is a reflection of the larger political, economic, and spiritual order. And whatever policy, strategy, or paradigm, such as broken windows, stop and frisk, etc., is operating at any given time, is a reflection of those larger political, economic, and moral struggles in that culture that is America. Along with the courts and corrections, law enforcement and policing is one of the three major components of the criminal justice system. A police force is just that, a constituted body of persons, workers, empowered by and working for a sovereign state to enforce the law, protect property, limit civil disorder, and preserve order. The police have as part of their powers the legitimized use of force as set forth by and authorized by that state and reflects the interests of that state as it is defined by the laws of that state. Now, to set us straight about all this is our guest for this evening's show, a dear friend and trusted colleague who I've come to respect and love as I've observed her juggle the politics of campus and departmental politics in the hot box that is John Jay College of Criminal Justice. She never wavers from seeing the larger goal of helping to create a fairer, more humane, and less racist system. So I'm pleased to welcome Professor Delores Jones-Brown, a professor in the Department of Law, Police Science, and Criminal Justice Administration. She's also the founding director of the John Jay College Center on Race, Crime, and Justice, where she currently serves as a faculty research fellow. So thank you so much, Dolores, for making it here. You literally, I don't know what, got up in the crack of dawn and from Virginia and made your way here, and thank you so much for doing so.
You're welcome.
I appreciate it very, very much.
Thank you for the invitation, Jim.
Wonderful. Well, before we get into some of the specific research that you've been working on, and ideas about transforming and reforming the police structure. These are news bulletins that just came out today from the Times, and I want to start our show by just reading a couple paragraphs from this.
Sure.
Paris attacks spur emergency edict and intense policing in France. All over France, from Toulouse in the south to Paris and beyond, the police have been breaking down doors, conducting searches without warrants, aggressively questioning residents, hauling suspects to police stations, and putting others under house arrest. The extraordinary steps are now perfectly legal under the state of emergency decreed by the government after the attacks on November 13th in Paris, a rare kind of mobilization that will continue. The French Parliament voted last week to extend the emergency for 3 more months, which means more warrantless searches, more interrogations, more people placed under house arrest by, of course, the police. There have been 1,072 police searches already and 139 police interrogations, and 117 people have placed in custody. Those included a weekend raid on a restaurant selling halal burgers and Tex-Mex food in the Paris suburbs, where officers found nothing suspicious after breaking down the doors. All right, now this goes on and on. This is in today's Times. Here's another news bulletin, briefly here. Chris Christie's bid gains new life as he invokes 9/11 amid fear. In the course of a 2-hour campaign stop, this is in New Hampshire, Governor Chris Christie of New Jersey brought a handful of men and women to tears, describing the deathbed wishes of his cancer-ridden mother, cracked them up with the declaration that his presidency would be golf-free, and riveted them with his remembrance of the family friends he lost on 9/11/2001. I live with these widows and orphans, he said, the emotion welling up in his throat as he recited the names of neighbors. I've looked into their eyes. Afterward, a stream of voters walked up to him, pledging their votes to an unexpected vessel for their newly heightened anxieties about security and terrorism. And finally, this is a report, a report that came out actually in April, documenting the number of Muslims killed since the early 1990s and actually the last 10 years of the war on terror. And these are figures that are often not mentioned to the American public, so I want to do that as well here and see how this all ties in. Last month, the Washington, D.C.-based Physicians for Social Responsibility released a landmark study concluding that the death toll from 10 years of the war on terror since the 9/11 attacks is at least 1.3 million and could be as high as 2 million. And that's not all of it here. According to the figures explored here, total deaths from Western interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan since the 1990s, from direct killings and the longer-term impact of war-imposed deprivation, likely constitute around 4 million, plus 2 million from the war on terror and 2 million in Iraq from 1991 to 2003. So we're talking about enormous violence, pain, suffering, fear, and we're also talking about a war on crime, war on drugs, mass incarceration that seems to have gotten out of control. And I know you're in the forefront, on the cutting edge of looking at ways of reforming the system, working within the system largely to make it more workable, to make it less racist, and we'd like to, find out what you've been doing and what you think still needs to be done in the face of these incredible statistics here.
I think that we are at a point where America has to be extremely careful, and it's clear to me that the nation is not aware of how careful it has to be. We had the 9/11 attacks. We've seen what happened in Paris. And part of those activities grow out of a sense of oppression, of people being oppressed by the United States. If the United States' response to those people is to oppress them more, the United States clearly doesn't recognize the way in which it is setting itself up for more harm, more danger. And I think there's a way in which America still believes it can be the bully who will, always win the fight. But typically the bully only wins the fight when nobody fights back. It's the case that when the bully fights back, when the victim fights back, that the bully often loses. But I don't think the United States sees itself in that position just yet. And it is clear that unless the U.S. can learn to negotiate more, rather than be reactionary, and rather than identify individuals as part of a group and then go after the entire group, rather than take the time to carefully and conscientiously pursue the individuals who are responsible for the acts of terror that we've been experiencing, the U.S. will set itself up for more harm in the future. And I don't see a lot of discussion that has that recognition included in it. I want to paraphrase something that is attributed to Benjamin Franklin. It says the nation that's willing to trade a little bit of security, a little bit of liberty for a little bit of security will lose both and deserve neither. And I think that's the road that we are headed down if we aren't able to check ourselves within the next few weeks or months. The idea that we are a nation open to refugees, and then because some individuals, engage in acts of violence, we then want to exclude all of the members that we associate with the folks. It's a sort of a classic form of racism. Yeah. It's like if the individual members of a group engages in behavior, we then attribute that particular behavior to the entire group. We don't tend to do it when whites engage in crime or acts of terrorism, right? So we had our domestic act of terrorism with Timothy McVeigh and his companion. We did not then, run wholesale out and begin to attack, middle-aged and young white men who we know are engaged in meetings and plotting kinds of
and hate
various,
groups,
various forms of, oppression and hate. Right. We can be more discerning when the enemy comes in white skin. We're far less discerning when the enemy comes in brown skin. And for my taste, that will be sort of the undoing of our efforts to be secure by taking the liberty of some.
Do you think the same sort of mindset is operating here in the criminal justice system and in our policing?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we've gone from aggressive stop and frisk in New York City as the primary means that the police department says that it's using and is engaging in, only in certain communities and in ways that harm those very communities that they say that they're protecting. And the police department may say, well, what do you mean? How are we harming people by trying to keep them safe? Once a person develops a criminal record, even if it's a minor criminal record, which is what comes from the aggressive use of broken windows policing, for blacks in particular, and for blacks and other people of color, we have research out of Princeton. Diva Pager has done the research that says that a white man with a criminal record stands a better chance of getting a job than a black man without a criminal record. So imagine what happens to the black man who accumulates the criminal record, even if they are for minor low-level offenses. For stop and frisk, we knew that about 90%, or data shows about 90% of the people who are stopped and frisked are people of color. About 90% of the folks are not found to be engaged in criminality at all. And the social psychologists have run tests with young people who live in communities where a great deal of stopping and frisking goes on. And those young people are depressed, they're afraid, they're confused, they have high levels of anxiety. And so for those young people, they have to fear both the criminals and the police. And that means that their development will be retarded in ways that will show up later in life.
The anger and humiliation that they're experiencing will in some way perhaps take another form, destructive form at some
They
later
certainly
point.
will express that anger and humiliation and confusion and anxiety and depression. Either that'll be turned inwards, it'll be turned outwards towards people in the community, or God forbid it will be turned towards the object of the oppression, and that's the police.
Right. So you're a respected academic, you're an activist, working within the leading criminal justice college in the country. What you've just said is pretty radical. How do you sort of work within the system and yet maintain some of the radical thoughts that you've expressed already here? Is there a way of trying to reform the system? There's still some hope here without pacifying, without co-opting, without not creating the same old, but in just a different form? And are there certain specific programs and research that you've been working on that can enlighten us, hopefully?
Well, since about 2011, myself and other academic researchers have been working with advocacy groups and grassroots organizations to come up with various solutions that might help the police better understand and better communicate and better relate to the communities they are policing the most.
Who are these advocacy groups? Now, how do you
So
decide
the umbrella organization is called Communities United for
Right.
Police Reform.
Exactly.
And the formal advocacy groups are like the New York Civil Liberties Union, the Center for Constitutional Rights, the Bronx Defenders, and grassroots organization would include various groups. The Malcolm X Grassroots Movement, Streetwise and Safe, Justice Committee, Make the Road New York. These are all organizations, some service youth and some service, folks of all ages who live in the communities that are policed. We like to use that word, police, the most. And there have been a couple of victories. One, for the first time, New York, the NYPD now has an inspector general that oversees its activities. It was a piece of legislation that was hard fought for and won, and that the department has resisted for many, many years. Recently, the governor signed a bill that would declare the New York State Attorney General as the special prosecutor in cases where the police kill civilians. Also, a piece of legislation that's been fought for many years. Anthony Baez's death in 1994, his mother Iris Baez asked for the special prosecutor back then, was not able to be successful in that request. And so we know that it's a time for change, or time of change.
It's a significant victory, right? I mean,
Several significant victories.
Significant victory, okay.
But my experience in doing this for over 30 years is that we have victories, and the sustainability of those victories have been sort of the issue. There is a wonderful piece of legislation that it outlaws discriminatory policing of all kinds. So it's not just racial profiling, it's also religious profiling. It's a profiling based on housing status, such as the homeless. Profiling based on sexual orientation or sexual identity. So the ban on discriminatory policing is a very broad one, and it covers very specialized groups, a wide array of specialized groups. And there are pending two pieces of legislation that exist under something called the Right to Know Act. So it would require the police to do two things: to identify themselves when they have an interaction with the public. We found that when people ask for a badge number or a name, that very often that makes the police officer act out because he or she takes that as a personal affront.
Right.
And so by requiring that the police routinely identify themselves and give out a business card with a number where the individual can call to complain, or give compliments. You know, very often the police think that when you shine the light on them, it's only for the purpose of criticizing them. But there are some police who are doing really good work, even when some of their colleagues are engaged in excessive use of force. And so those police officers deserve the recognition for their positive behavior, but their colleagues also deserve recognition for their bad behavior. There's a body of research that suggests that if the police are not anonymous, that if we remove the anonymity, that the police actually do behave better. So that part of the reason why some police officers act out is because they feel that there is no way to identify them and there will be no consequences for their bad behavior. The other thing that's real important, police say, oh, well, we received consent to search. So there's a large body of research that suggests that they're only asking people of color for consent to search. And so people unwittingly provide the evidence against themselves, even when the police had no reason to suspect that they were engaged in criminality. The police were engaging in pure racial profiling or pure discriminatory policing because someone lives in a high crime area or they live in a poor community and the police feel that they can take more liberty with them. So the second part of the Right to Know Act would require that the police tell people they have a right not to consent to a search when the search is not based on probable cause. And so we're hoping that those two pieces of legislation will pass, and it will provide a layer of transparency and accountability for police behavior that does not currently exist.
Is there much resistance to this by the police themselves?
Unfortunately, what seems like a sort of really common sense, important thing to do if you want your public to trust you and to support you is being resisted by politicians and the police department. And the reasons for the resistance is not quite clear, other than it's just not what the police are used to. The police are used to being in control and in charge. And there's a way in which arguably the department, NYPD and any other department, does not accept or realize that the control that they've exerted over communities of color and over poor communities, despite the fact that they claim it's for the purpose of providing public safety for those groups, are damaging them. And there is not a genuine conversation that's taken place to which the police are being responsive. The police have decided that, you know, they know what's good for the public, and the public, no matter how much they say. And it's interesting, I want to roll that back just a little bit because there's this notion that the police often talk about, well, the public supports what we're doing. And then the question is, which public are you talking about? So they often talk about business owners, churchgoers, property owners, and people who are employed. And that, unfortunately, in this day and age, makes up a very small part of the public. With the economic downturn of 2008, we have far more unemployed people. It's always been the case that people of color in urban communities are less likely to be homeowners than they are to be renters. Very few people own businesses, and people may or may not go to church. And so there's a way in which when police departments say, well, we have the support of the public, they're talking about a very narrow slice of the public, and they're choosing, therefore, intentionally to disregard the other part of the public that does not fit into those four groups. And that's a mistake on their part, and it's in part why we're seeing the protests that we do.
You know, both of us have a lot of students in our classes, right, who are would-be police officers, who are police officers. My feeling is, as you're describing this legislation, that the rank and file, our students as a whole, might not really object to this as much as the higher-ups and politicians. Is that your feeling?
So interestingly, we had a what social scientists call a focus group at John Jay in November of last year, and there were definitely police officers who were all for the notion that they wanted to be closer to their public, that they wanted to have more discretion in terms of how they engage with their public. And most of them said, we would like to be able to police constitutionally, that they
majority, most felt that way.
Yeah,
okay.
I would, in this particular group of about 20 to 25 police officers. Now, most of the group were officers of color. And it's not to suggest that white officers don't also have the same sentiment, but it seems, it's been my experience that officers of color, particularly black officers, in part because they themselves end up being victims of their colleagues' attention, negative attention, when they're out of uniform. And so they understand what it's like to be accused of crime when they're not in fact engaged in any criminality. They understand what it's like to live in a community where the police constantly surveil and interfere with the liberty of residents. And so having been on the receiving end, I find that those officers are more appreciative of and accepting of the possibility that the relationship between the police and the community does not have to be one where the police are always there to exercise control over the community, where the police are there to help and help in a way that doesn't involve enforcement activity.
What did you mean by that last point there? Control, domination,
right.
or ego?
Right. So there's this whole notion that
the
phrase is, officer friendly, right?
Right.
So there was a time when police officers provided service to the community beyond just law enforcement or crime fighting. And so
community policing, or more than that?
Yeah, sort of more than that. And typically, and people think that only happened in suburban communities, but it included getting cats out of trees, responding to disputes in a way that no one had to be arrested. I was recently talking to some police folks and some folks who were policed in the 50s and 60s and 70s, where the police officer really did say, okay, I'm going to take you home to your mom or dad, as opposed to lock you up. And that image of the police officer and that experience for those who've had it has faded. And when you use the terminology, everything's been a war. There is an interesting new book, I highly recommend it if you haven't read it already. It's called The Rise of the Warrior Cop by Belko. And so he traces the origins of SWAT teams. And he talks about how SWAT teams were initially identified as a means to intervene in a serious active shooter or active aggressive situation. And they went from being used for those limited purposes to routinely executing search warrants for drugs, even drugs as benign as marijuana. And so the notion that you can have a drug that in 4 states is legal, but there's a SWAT team exercising search warrants or executing search warrants with the guns, the uniforms, the outfits, the ninja outfits sometimes, the helmets, and
plastic shields,
and
high tech
and military grade weaponry.
Exactly, tanks
for the purpose of executing a drug warrant for marijuana. It should boggle the mind, and the fact that it has become routine, and people have not until fairly recently made serious complaints about it. Is evidence of a kind of acquiescence to government control and power that was probably generated by the same kinds of fear that now we see in the terrorist situations. So I would call it an overreaction to the behavior of a few people, and because those people belong to certain groups, the groups that we have typically targeted and oppressed, there's a part of the American public who's willing to sort of go along and say, yeah, that's how those people need to be treated. And until we can roll that back, we are probably going to see some things get uglier before they get pretty. Now, the fact that the evidence that these things can be rolled back is the way in which the current heroin epidemic among middle-class whites, particularly middle-class white youth, are being handled very differently than the heroin epidemic of the 60s, 70s. So young people, young white children who overdosed on heroin are being talked to by the police department about coming into treatment. There's an interesting article that I shared with my class recently where a former narcotics officer, white narcotics officer, says that he's not sure why he thinks differently about addicts now. He says they're just people, they just engage in crime because they're trying to feed their habit, and they need help. Now, I suspect that was not his mindset when he was enforcing drug laws against the black and brown people. And so it says something very problematic that he can't recognize the reasons why he changed his attitude towards addicts.
And so his level of consciousness is still very limited, even though he feels that this is what needs to be done. Now, does this get also pursued when he's involved with black heroin addicts?
And that becomes the question.
Yeah,
because
so we're still not sure.
And I'm relatively sure that that mindset is not consistent across group.
So we're back to that issue of race again, that Black Lives Matter has been over the past couple of years or so beginning to confront or try to get our politicians, try to get our various leaders, the media and so on, to confront. So we need to have this deeper conversation that is going to be even more painful because white privilege is something that is so accepted, just taken for granted. You're really going to have to dig down here and grapple with these long believed notions, internalized notions. And to do that with the police, who already have a notion that, well, we're the authority figures. I mean, come on, leave us alone. Why question anything we're doing? So on top of that, you're dealing with issues of race and class and gender and so on. So it's a monumental issue. And tackling it as you do with these programs, I mean, certainly it's a start. It's a way of beginning to have the conversation, right? But what we really are talking about is the need for massive movements like the 60s to sort of go back to that larger discussion, right?
Right, and I think a great deal has to do with education. I gave a talk up in the Berkshires weekend before last to a group of very diverse audience, and when I mentioned to one person that the police used to help communities, and there's a wonderful article from 1988. And interestingly enough, one of the authors is George Kelling of the Broken Windows thesis, right? And they talked about when European immigrants came to the United States, the police were there to help them assimilate. So the police department ran soup kitchens, it helped people find jobs, it helped people find housing.
White ethnics essentially helping other white ethnics.
White ethnics helping other white ethnics. And even though those white ethnics had on uniforms and they were called the police, they were performing these social service kinds of functions. And so the fact that we have gotten to a place where police officers, when they say, I'm just doing my job, rarely do they mean that they're providing a social service, has everything to do, I believe, with who it is that they see themselves as responsible for policing. And so typically I say the modern day police are considered their job as controlling and containing, the criminals who all too often they see as people who are black and brown or people who are poor or people who live in certain communities. Even when folks outside those categories of people engage in crime, their crime is seen as atypical. And so we know that we've had these mass shootings, and most of the mass shootings involve white males as perpetrators. But there's a way in which those white males who cause more harm in a single incident than some communities suffer in an entire year, those white males aren't seen as problematic. They have a mental health problem. But how do we know that many of the young men who are engaged in, and again, I want to roll that back just a little bit, because in any given community, the number of serious violent offenders are limited in number, regardless of how poor that community is, how much it is a community of color. the serious violent offenders are few in number. But in the communities of color, when the police talk about the serious violent offenders, they talk about them in a way as if everyone in that community is either involved in serious violence or has the potential to engage in serious violence. And we don't do that when we see our white male mass killers go into places. They become very individualized. And the police departments, I would say around the country and arguably around the world, have become incapable of individualizing offenders when they are of color.
So that gets back to your point about education, right? So you're talking about police education that needs to break down this stereotyping and profiling, and where does that education take place?
I think it needs to take place everywhere, that in the police academy itself, right. And that it would start with reversing the warrior mentality, which apparently has been being reinforced and is sometimes introduced to police officers in the academy. There are several law review articles out where it's noted that as part of the instruction in too many academies today, the police are told, you know, your life is in danger every moment that you're out on the street. When Mr. Belko, who wrote The Rise of the Warrior Cop, came to John Jay to talk about his book, he had these magnificent graphs where he said that policing is actually safer today, and it's been safer over the last 30 years than at any time in history. So there is a counter narrative to the available facts. So the facts say policing is safer, but the instruction that many cadets are receiving in the academy is that you've got to be on guard at all moments because everyone's out to kill you, everyone's out to hurt you. And so when they take that mentality into the streets, they respond to people with the notion that they are fearful of being killed. And as we've seen, for very simple things like allegedly selling cigarettes, people are dying.
Right. But we've also seen, right, this past weekend, Police Chief Bratton brought out this new unit that is going to presumably protect and save us from a terrorist attack. And it was a very militaristic display. They had operations in the city to make that clear that this is going to be the response. And the long guns, as he put it. And again, Balco notwithstanding, that is the counter argument, and that's what the public sees. They're fearful, so a Christie or Trump or any of these characters can make a reference to that and win votes, and of course they're not above doing that. That's what they do most of the time anyway. So again, how do we break this cycle and bring us to what Cornel West has been talking about recently, radical love, this beloved community, if you want to use a more religious term, but you know, people getting along with each other better. I mean, that's a dramatically different narrative to have.
Right.
And that radical love, we're going to have actually next week. Professor Kim, who's teaching the course with Cornell on the show, and we're going to spend the hour on this notion of radical love, which often comes from trauma and a catastrophic experience, and somehow using that as a way of expressing your humanity. And that, of course, was epitomized with King in the Civil Rights Movement. Here, and rather than turn to violence and to create an ISIS-type reaction to the trauma and brutality that black people faced, they engendered this radical love to try to heal and restore a community of America. That's quite a heavy load. And as you probably know, Reverend Barber, who I hope to have on this show at some point too, the leader of the Moral Mondays movement, is probably the foremost figure that follows in King's footsteps. I mean, this is an incredible discussion to have, where most of the country, black and white, are far from having. So when you talk about education, where do we start? Where do we go with it? And how far can we, and Black Lives Matter, people like Barber, this whole notion of radical love be brought into literally our police departments? Restorative justice might be another way of possibly putting Fania Davis.
So you know, and I don't mean to denigrate the people who believe in restorative justice, but I think we are not being honest with ourselves when we look at the history of race and justice in this country. And so rather than restoring justice that never really was,
Right.
we would have to build justice for certain communities. So the Brandeis University did this research regarding the wealth gap, the racial wealth gap. And so the notion that whites, even whites without college educations, the median income is 22 times greater than that of black families and 15 times greater than that of Latino families, suggests that capitalism is the biggest culprit in all of this. And that for those white families that have the $110,000 median income compared to the $7,000 median income for Latinos and the less than $5,000 median income for blacks, there's something for those white families to preserve. And for the Latino and black families, not so much. And so the idea that they need to be able, the black and Latino families need to be able to somehow try to make up that distance between their own median family incomes and that of whites. In a society where we've allowed big business to export most of the jobs, take away the kinds of medical and other benefits that were a routine part of the reason why you went to work for a company for a long period of time. We've got governors breaking up unions. So the socioeconomic structure is in the exact opposite direction of one that would be necessary to bring about this radical love. Because the people who have, called the 99% fight over the crumbs, and the people with the bigger crumbs feel like they have to do whatever it takes to keep their bigger crumb, even though it is still a crumb. And I think that's something we see with the rhetoric that comes out of Donald Trump and the people who are attracted to that rhetoric, that they're sort of, you know, mice in a barrel fighting over crumbs. But if I've got the bigger crumb, then I need to be able to do whatever it takes for me to keep my big crumb, as opposed to recognizing that unless we are willing and able to reverse the trend of big business controlling everything in this nation, that we will not be able to move to radical love. We can't love because we're too busy competing with each other over very, very small stakes. But some stakes are seen as higher simply because, again, a 22 times wealth gap that's a pretty big gap. And apparently most of it, at least half of it, came about after 2008. So we allowed big business to get completely out of control. We allowed for the development of a debt industry, right? It used to be that people, to be debt-free was an important part of American life. But then we allowed the creation of a debt industry that people are fearful of losing their jobs. And anyone in the 55 plus age group knows that you lose your job because your salary is too big and the companies want to bring in a younger person that they can pay less and give less benefits. And so in the time of people's lives when they should be able to sort of be relaxing and moving into retirement, instead they're worrying about how they're going to live, and people are living longer. And so you need more money to live because you're going to live longer. And so you've got older people afraid, you've got younger people who can't find jobs, and you've got folks who've gone into debt for higher education and they're not getting the return that they were told they would get from investing in higher education. And so we have a mess. We have a mess, but the 1% kind of sit quietly by and watch the 99 scramble over what's left. And then you have a Donald Trump, who's part of that 1%, fueling the flames of contention and competition by saying the really ugly things that he says about immigrants and others, rather than saying, if you're not Native American, in some generation, you are an immigrant. We are a nation of immigrants. And so as a nation of immigrants, we should come together and figure out a way to be more inclusive rather than exclusive. And, you know, and he says overtly, and it seems to me that there should be some, and I'm a lawyer and I believe in the First Amendment, but there's certainly ways in which, if nothing else, ethics and morality should dictate that there are certain things that just cannot be said as part of a presidential campaign. Because if you allow the kinds of hurtful and hateful things that this particular candidate has been allowed to say, there are people who will think it must be okay to say this because this is a candidate for president of the United States. There was a time when the presidency was a more dignified office than that even if you thought that was your mindset, you didn't go out and say it in public places. You didn't say it and wear it as a badge of honor. And so we have slid in a direction that, again, we think that by being more oppressive, we're going to make ourselves more safe. We will produce a completely opposite reaction.
The psychodynamics of a Donald Trump, as well as the larger culture, feeds on that inequality, in a sense, to justify their own success.
That's right.
And denying or declining to understand the deeper structural issues that are involved there. In an otherwise pretty miserable interview with Trump the other week, Barbara Walters was on the Trump helicopter and, you know, spinning around Manhattan and asked him, well, which are the buildings that you own and, you know, this and that. And then she said, what other buildings would you want to own? And he said, Barbara, I'd love to own it all. And that insatiability, that greed, that power to dominate, you've expressed it. James Gilligan, who we've also had on the show, as well documented, inequality rates around the world produce, in those countries that have the highest inequality rates, also produce the highest rates of violence, and that cuts across culture, race. So it's all there. It's well documented. As you were talking, you know, and from my opening there, the police, what are the police just basically there to follow the laws of the state? I mean, this still is, or we say it still is, a democracy. We also say, or certainly should emphasize, that the police get their power from the people. And this is a government still of the people, by the people, for the people. At least that's the rhetoric. So my point is, or the question is, in the face, it just seems over and over and over again that the police, in their understandably striving to be more professionalized, more polite perhaps, more transparent, still, when it comes down to it, are doing the bidding and are supporting the powers that be. That's the way it's defined. I mean,
well,
you see what I'm saying? And so where do they become somewhat independent, moral individuals within a structure that, as you're so eloquently pointed out, is so destructive and so hell-bent on further brutality?
The notion,
keeping people down.
So the notion that we, the big we, have subscribed to policing strategies that are really about controlling and containing certain groups, and the fact that we have sort of famous police commissioners, and so that's a problem in and of itself, right? That we could have people who are commissioners, and to be very blunt and say, you know, in New York City, we've had 2 commissioners who became legends in their own minds and in their own times, and became invested in maintaining their own legacy as opposed to responding to the needs of all of their constituents.
Become media personalities and celebrities.
Media personalities,
and at
celebrities.
Times more important than the mayor.
Rich rich.
Very rich.
The current
all out in the
commissioner,
Hamptons.
when he was not commissioner, I understand had his own security company that made a significant amount of money. I'm sure that the former commissioner is making money on the lecture circuit, and it became very clear that those two individuals, it became about them, while they claimed what they were doing was about the people. But again, for those folks who were not the churchgoers, were not the business owners, were not the homeowners, and were not employed, they did not speak for or to those people, and they didn't respond to the complaints that those folks made. Until and unless it could be shown somehow it was in their interest, meaning the two commissioners' interest to do so. Mm-hmm. And quite frankly, I think Michael Bloomberg and Ray Kelly left those offices without ever having said, I had an obligation, or we had an obligation, to listen to the other New Yorkers. And we chose not to do that because we thought we were doing what was right. And at the end of the day, that's paternalism at its worst. Mm-hmm. And, people say, you work for me. How can you dictate to me how you're going to police me when in fact you work for me? And by the end of the old administration, that was happening. We see a repeat pattern. Commissioner Bratton has a particular policing strategy that he has a great deal of faith in. And so no matter what the people who are not the business owners, churchgoers, homeowners, or the employed, no matter what the people that fall outside those groups say in terms of the harm they are experiencing at the hands of police who are engaged in broken windows policing, the commissioner has decided that this is the strategy that he believes will keep the city safe. And therefore, if it harms those other people, so be it.
So be it. Well, again, that's why it's so important for these movements to develop questioning that system. And I think there is hope among our students and some of the young people, the Reverend Barbers of the world. So I see hope in that too. Resisting these policies, and certainly you're one of the rare academic activists who are in the forefront of really establishing some of the programs and policies that can really make a difference. So I thank you so much again for being here and enlightening us.
I would love to be, before we go, because there's this way in which there's no belief that other things are possible. Chiefs of color, and even one chief who was not of color, have been far more progressive in terms of how they interact with their public. So there was a chief from New Haven who actually had a youth panel that would interview all new recruits. The chief in Houston has a chat with the chief line where people can call in and talk to him. In Detroit, the police department would mentor young men whose fathers were in prison. It was all voluntary. And in Orlando, Florida, the chief was able to solve her triple homicide by calling a meeting with the people in the housing development where the homicide occurred, rather than kicking down doors. So we know that there are models that are being used in other police departments. The question is, how do we get more celebrity police chiefs to adopt some of those more
well, we've got to get them to listen to our program.
Power sharing techniques.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree with you more. So listen, the police are doing the job that society has set out and directed them to do. We should realize that they are part of a hardline law and order, punitive perspective based on a fear-based, one-dimensional, get them before they get us view of life. Punishment, retribution, or the threat of punishment is at the centerpiece of this worldview. It's a cynically rooted, paternalistic sense of perceived moral, economic, racial, and political superiority. It creates a dependent scapegoat population that's perpetuated in a never-ending cycle of fear, mistrust, and violence. Programs and policies that flow from this perspective should be fairly obvious. Wars on crime, drugs, terror, the death penalty, stop and frisk, mass incarceration, school to prison pipeline, solitary confinement, mandatory minimum sentences, 3 strikes laws, broken windows, mass electronic surveillance of the domestic and foreign populations of the world are all good examples. As we imagine ways to heal, reform, and transform our criminal justice system and its links to the larger world, we're encouraged to not think in terms of absolutes and either-or solutions. The question is not reform or revolution, or reform and revolution, but imagining what that transformative world might look like and working concretely toward bringing it about. A key element in that analysis is not resorting or settling for reforms that pacify or allow new systems of social control to emerge, thus perpetuating the same oppression but only in different forms. Another way of putting it is that we should try to understand what form this change might take and look like and guard against it becoming some of the same old, same old. This won't be easy. Black Lives Matter, the various Occupy movements, Bernie Sanders, 350.org, Reverend Barber, among countless others are asking the tough questions on economic equality, ecological destruction of the environment, white privilege, and the violent militarism that maintains the American empire. Physicians for Social Responsibility, as I've documented and I've mentioned, after 10 years of the war on terror since the 9/11 attacks, as many as 2 million Muslims have been killed. Total deaths from Western interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan since the 1990s, from direct killings and the longer-term impact of war-imposed deprivation, likely constitute around 4 million dead. These are difficult figures to confront and even comprehend. It's also difficult to confront an American criminal justice system and police strategies rooted in a similar worldview. But that's what we need to do. We need to confront and imagine. That's the first step toward healing and bringing about the peace and beloved human community through radical love that we all presumably say we want. Thank you so much, Dolores, for your courage and humanity and being one of those rare scholar activists who pushes that arc toward a more just world. And thank you for watching. Next week, we will have Professor David Kim on as our guest. He's teaching a course on radical love at Union Theological Seminary with Cornell West. This is your host, Jim Vrettos, inviting you to tune in next Sunday evening at this time for another segment of The Radical Imagination.